So, dear brothers and sisters, greetings from Rome, from OISG, and a most cordial welcome to all of you to this important webinar on care and safeguarding under the title Responding to Concerns and Allegations. It is the first safeguarding webinar of this year, and more will follow. And a great number has registered for this, and we are very happy that you have come. And I really like to extend a cordial welcome to all of you. We will have a moment of prayer led by Sister Roxanne. By the way, I am Sister Mary John from OISG, Associate Executive Secretary, and Sister Roxanne shares is a school sister of Notre Dame and is also the Associate Executive Secretary of OISG. So Roxanne and I work together in the executive team with Sister Pat Murray. Sister Roxanne, thank you for leading us in prayer.
Thank you, Sister Mary John. So I will share my screen now to invite us into this moment of prayer. As we enter into this time of prayer, I invite us to center ourselves with a deep awareness of being with God and God with us. And during this prayer time and throughout our entire webinar, let us be attentive to what God is calling us to, who to be, how to respond to various needs in our world today, and especially the needs of those who are most vulnerable in our lives. And I offer this prayer that I found some weeks ago, written by a victim survivor of church abuse, where she extends God's call to us. So I will read it slowly, and then we will have some music, a song that helps us center again on who we are called to be at this time in our world. Loving God, thank you for entrusting to us your work here on earth. We pray through your Spirit that you will empower us to do the right thing for the benefit of those suffering abuse and injustice. That we will not fear to be bringers of your justice. That we will be your voice for those whose voices are silenced. That when your light shines into dark areas of abuse, we will have courage as your representatives to face our fears, to show your heart of compassion and justice, and to speak your words of life and freedom into broken hearts. Teach us as a church to be your body, fully knitted together and working in unity to care for one another with extra care and dignity. Enable us to be instruments of your love, that chains will be broken and broken hearts restored. That will we teach everyone how precious they are to you, that they will know you are a God who sees and feels their pain. We pray that through your Spirit and church, fully trusting in your word, Victims will become victors, and their mess become a precious message to your love and restoration in their lives. We ask this in your name and for your glory. Amen.
May all I do today be for the healing of the whole. May all I do today
Mary John, thank you very much, and it's lovely to see you. Can I say it's also lovely to see a lot of familiar faces this afternoon, some of whom I've already been working with this month, whether it's been in the UK, Rome, Scotland, and indeed in Nairobi last week. So it's lovely to see you all again, and others who are very familiar faces. So I'm talking to you from Scotland. I must confess I am not Scottish, but this is where I live when I don't live in Rome or anywhere else. Can I just say before we start the importance of taking care? Some of this might touch you personally, or it might trigger a memory in relation to others that you care for in your community or in your congregation. It's not my intention to do anything terribly emotive or scary this evening, but just to be aware of that taking care. This is also being recorded, so can I ask you to be careful with what you share? Because I'm going to be focusing on concerns and allegations, this must inevitably bring to mind current situations some of you are maybe having to deal with or indeed struggling with, and others in the past that you might be reflecting on, maybe that could have been different because of all sorts of other factors. But please be careful what you share, particularly when we come back into the larger group. In your breakout groups, you can discuss the level of confidentiality that you have. We will not be recording the breakout groups. We will be asking, and I'm hoping that we'll have some feedback, but just be aware of what's a safe place. So I'll just share my screen with you. Okay. And that photograph is one of my own, which I took towards the end of last year. It was I actually went to visit the crib in St. Peter's Square, and it was a particularly beautiful blue sky. And I'm sure many of you are familiar with these beautiful blue skies that we have in Rome. Can I also say it's a delight to be back presenting. I haven't presented a webinar since last year, I think, for the UISG. So it's great to be able to do that again. So this is where we are going to navigate ourselves around for the next few minutes. I'm going to be inviting you to think about responding to concerns and allegations in safeguarding, within a safeguarding context. You will, I'm sure, be very well aware of concerns and allegations within your own places of work and ministries, and indeed even in your own communities, and also your own families. But we're going to look at it under the safeguarding umbrella today. So I'm going to do something with you on definitions and how do we distinguish as well, which is important, and identifying concerns and indeed allegations. But I'm also hopefully introducing you to the concept of low-level concerns and an extremely helpful document which was produced by a law firm in the UK during COVID. And I'll tell you more about that later. And then to talk about allegations and then have some examples. Now, in many ways, this might look a very straightforward webinar for this afternoon. Okay, it's very straightforward. We just need to know what's a concern, what's an allegation, and then how do we respond? And I'm sure we are all familiar with the request from the Vatican about in Vos Estis Lux Mundi in terms of the importance of mandatory reporting. My experience is that this is still a struggle in some religious communities and congregations. So we'll explore that later. I think it's important to look at, we know what to do, but what happens when we're confronted with the reality of having to do it? So how might you define the word concern? We don't often see that in safeguarding policies, although I have to say, in the ones that I've been involved in helping congregations write, I ensure that we have a whole section on concerns and allegations, because the tendency sometimes in safeguarding is that people go to training and then suddenly they become detectives overnight, or they become suspicious detectives. And I was working with an international congregation, some of whom are online here today, in Nairobi last week. They'd happened to choose Nairobi as a location for their international meeting. But that was something that came up during the conference. Now we've acquired some skills or additional skills to what we already had. How do we prevent ourselves becoming suspicious of almost everybody? And how do we stop then becoming safeguarding police or safeguarding detectives? So I think it's important to be proportionate. And my key response is always, what's the intention in someone's actions? What is the intention in what someone might say? Well, the Cambridge English Dictionary gives us a very simple definition of what is a concern. And I'm sure this is something which everyone here has had experience of. It's a worried or nervous feeling about something, or something that makes you feel worried. Another way of explaining it is something that gives you a sense of unease. How often do we encounter situations and at the time we have a sense of unease? We feel uncomfortable, but we cannot always name it. Or maybe we encounter a situation involving others that we witness, and it makes us feel a sense of unease, a nagging doubt, and yet we cannot always verbalize what that means. So exploring concerns further, it's difficult, I think, because we might use the word concern to express our care towards someone or in relation to a particular situation. We might be concerned that someone is unwell. We might be concerned about the political status of our world, and quite rightly at the moment. But in terms of safeguarding, it's also about behavior which is observed or heard which is inappropriate. Think about in your ministry, and indeed, dare I say, in your community life, when have you observed behavior which is inappropriate, but nobody seems to have responded to it? Or indeed, if someone does respond, they are reassured that everything is okay, or this person behaves like this most of the time, and they don't mean any harm, or that's just the way they are. So it's behavior which is observed, or indeed behavior which is heard, which is inappropriate. Sometimes even in relatively casual conversation, some people might say something which leaves us with that sense of unease, that this wasn't really appropriate for this context. So it's behavior, whether in words or actions, which contradict the code of conduct. Now, this is critically important. And I want to talk here a little bit about the code of conduct. My work with religious, particularly since I became independent over the last 4 years or so, there are themes which emerge strangely and coincidentally, often across many congregations, both of men and women. For the last, I would say, 6 or 8 months or so, I have regularly been asked about codes of conduct. What are they? How do we write one? Or indeed, where do we find one? Now, if you Google code of conduct in the Catholic Church, you will find loads. You can instantly download, copy, and paste. I'm trying to encourage communities and congregations, and indeed organizations, to create their own code of conduct. We can look at someone else's code of conduct and tick all the boxes, and say, yes, that is how we will behave, this is what we will do, or this is what we will not do. Whereas if a code of conduct emerges not only from the community life and charism of a congregation, but also out of their safeguarding policy, the code of conduct should be something which emerges from your safeguarding policy and is something which is central to your safeguarding policy. So it should be about how we behave as individuals, how we relate to ourselves. Then how do we relate in community life? And how do we relate in ministry? Now, I'm sure that many of you, and I know that many of you on this webinar already have a code of conduct for your community. Some of you also will tell me you have them in your schools. You will have them in other forms of ministry, in parishes and so on. But if you don't have one, it really is worth thinking about how do you create a code of conduct. Now, this doesn't become a document to punish people with, but it does become a focus in terms of behavior. And a code of conduct can address some of these concerns or concerning behaviors, which some people might demonstrate in community life and in ministry. So we need to think about any communication which is written online. It can be visual images. It can be lots of things which might indicate a potential or actual risk to others, particularly the vulnerable. So what do we have? How do we speak? How do we relate? How do we behave in relation to those who are vulnerable, which might actually be a risk to them? And of course, and very importantly, signs of grooming should be observed as a concern. And I know there are many on this webinar who have listened to me talking about grooming. And I am still meeting in international groups, men and women religious who are struggling with the concept of grooming. So another good word for grooming is manipulation. Signs of manipulation should be observed as a concern. Many of you know that grooming can often be misunderstood as kindness, and that is often the dilemma. If somebody is being kind, does that mean they are grooming you or me? Or are they just being kind? So it's very important to understand that dilemma, really. But always, always, what is the intention? What is the intention? I see someone has already raised their hand. If your question is a technical one, if you can put it in the chat, then one of my good colleagues in Rome will be able to respond to that in terms of language you're not hearing. But if it's a question in relation to the content, if you could hold on until we just pause before we have time for reflection, that would be helpful for me. Thank you. Now, this is the document I want to bring to your attention. It's called Developing and Implementing a Low-Level Concerns Policy, a guide for organizations which work with children. It's by Farah and Co. They are a law firm in the UK. There is the link to their website, and you can download the policy from their website. So it's for public use. However, I would urge you that if you do use it and you reference it, that you always acknowledge that it is their work. I find it extremely helpful in safeguarding training, because it talks about not only concerns, but it identifies what do we mean by low-level concerns, okay? I could do a whole presentation just on this document for you, but it is, what do we understand as low-level concerns? Because very often low-level concerns are the ones which are dismissed. How often, sadly in the history of the church and relatively recently, are we aware of some continuing horrendous scandals that are happening? They are either scandals around individuals, or they are scandals around some of the many reports which have been produced. Some of you will be aware of, in the diocese in the north of Italy, in Bolzano, they recently became the first diocese in Italy to produce an account of the abuse cases which have taken place there. But many of you will be aware of all the other reports we've had in Munich, in Australia, in Spain, and so on. Many, many reports. And France as well. Many, many countries have produced reports. And the effect or the outcome of some of them remains limited. We understand that there's been some good developments in some countries, and they've really looked at learning and the implementation of recommendations. But how often, and I think this is not only in the church, but this happens in other places, how often does something happen, serious situation, and then there's an investigation, and then there's a report produced, and then nothing. So the report sits on a desk in a drawer somewhere, and some of the recommendations might have been implemented, but how often is there an attitude which says, well, we reviewed it formally and we wrote about the recommendations, but where's the next step? Where's the real learning in that? But when we have scandals in the church, and many of you will be aware of this too, how often have people come forward and said, I was concerned about that person's behavior. I had heard that person speak. I knew that that person was doing things which are not in keeping with living a vowed life, for example. Or people came forward and made allegations, and I'm raising this word allegations, or concerns about the individual, but they were dismissed because the individual was seen as being someone who is very powerful and holding great authority, and indeed doing very great work for the church. I don't need to name these individuals because many of you will know about them. But there's a pattern here. Something happens. It comes to light that someone has a history, indeed, of goodness, but also a history where they have been abusing the young and the vulnerable. Concerns were raised and they were ignored, or those who came forward were silenced. So it's critically important that we start to really understand the impact of low-level concerns. It's very important. So this is a very useful policy for you to read. It does help you develop a low-level concerns policy, but also extremely helpful towards most of the book actually includes live cases or real cases. They all have now concluded, but criminal cases of abuse of children where boundaries were pushed, where concerns were ignored, time and time again. Some of you living in the UK will certainly recognize some of these cases because they hit the news, the media, in relation to them. There are some also from the US. That's been a limit in terms of their ability to resource these international cases, but there are very good ones in relation to education as well. So that Farah and Co. document is a very useful one to read. And this is a very useful quotation too. If people can identify concerning behavior, even if it is potentially minor, and understand the importance of sharing their concerns early, this can be critical to more effective safeguarding. So if we can identify concerning behavior, even if it's minor, even if it's low level, and understand the importance of sharing concerns, this can be critical to more effective safeguarding. Now, again, I will repeat, this doesn't mean that we suddenly become safeguarding detectives and we become suspicious about everyone's behavior. We also have to be mindful about sharing concerns early and also sharing concerns appropriately. So this doesn't just become an excuse, for example, to just gossip about someone's behavior or be suspicious about what someone is doing. But that sharing concerns is very important. And again, in situations where I have been involved in supporting superiors or provincials or bishops through case management of the accused, how often it emerges that concerns were noticed by individuals, but they never spoke to anyone. They never raised it with anyone for many reasons. They were afraid to, or they thought they would be dismissed. But this appropriate sharing is important. So this in turn can help foster a culture and environment in which more serious issues are prevented from developing. It can be extremely effective in terms of prevention. You know, for years, when child protection started, we talked about child protection. And then in some countries, and I know this is still the case in some parts of Africa, they talk about child safeguarding, so to broaden it beyond protection. We now try and talk about safeguarding as being the protection of those who are young and vulnerable, so not only children, but also adults. So it's about their protection. It's also about prevention. If we get stuck on just protection, we won't be thinking about how to prevent abuse. Many of you in different contexts have heard me talk about what are the causes of abuse in our church. And indeed, many of you know, you agree with me, you know what some of the causes are. But if we know the causes, then what are we doing about prevention? So that, again, there has to be some connection in terms of our actions. The terminology low-level concerns is used to describe minor safeguarding concerns. Okay, that does mean that if you are aware of a low-level concern, this isn't, the automatic response is not to run off to the police or to make a complaint, okay? It's about noting it, it's about being aware of it. And indeed, it may well be the time to have a difficult conversation with someone. And I know how difficult conversations are difficult. That's why they're called difficult. I also know how difficult it can be for men and women in religious life and ministry to actually face the challenge of a difficult conversation. This choice of term is intended to encourage the act of sharing and reporting such concerns. And indeed, they may well relate to physical, emotional, or sexual behavior. So it's the act of sharing and reporting concerns is very helpful. And it doesn't necessarily mean that the other person will agree with you. They might say, well, the way I interpreted that was or is. But on the other hand, they may well agree with you and say, do you know, I've had an uneasy feeling about that person's behavior for a while now. Some of you are well aware of the concept of red flags. I think the idea of red flags is extremely helpful because we can identify concerns as red flags. And it can be the way that someone speaks about or to children and or vulnerable people. I am sure that many of you will have had the experience of being with someone or indeed a group of people, and it's the way that that individual speaks about children or about vulnerable people. You know, it can be in a very disrespectful way. It can be in a very inappropriate sexual way even. So how do they speak about children or vulnerable people? Or indeed, how do they speak to children or vulnerable people? It can also be the way someone touches or behaves when close to children and or vulnerable people. And I'm not talking here about directly sexual touching, But there is a certain level in all of us where we can have a sense of unease when someone is physically too close to us. We have an inbuilt sense very often about who we can trust and what someone's intention, to use the word I've already used before, and motivation is in terms of how they touch someone or they want to be physically close to another. I think children are very good at that sense as well. I think children have a very good sense of when they can feel safe or not. Sadly, of course, that doesn't always happen for some children. They are very trusting. And for vulnerable people and for children and adults with disabilities, of course, they are unable to communicate that sense of unease. Developing the ability then to spot red flags means increasing an awareness of actual or potential risk of harm. So it's very important to continue to widen the understanding to actual or potential, because how often, and I'm sure this resonates with many of you, in the church, when we've had difficulties, when we've had difficult behavior, how often has the response been, well, nothing actually happened. Nothing actually happened. There is, sadly, amongst some working in the church, some in ministry, a lack of understanding of sexual abuse, for example. So some limit their understanding of sexual abuse to sexual touching, to rape, to sexual assault, and they don't have an understanding of non-contact sexual abuse. Many of you will know this, I know, but what we understand by or mean by non-contact sexual abuse is when there is actually no physical contact between the perpetrator and the victim, but the perpetrator of abuse can force the victim to watch, for example, adult pornography, or to watch child abuse images, or indeed to watch others commit sexual acts in front of them. And I hope you can see why I'm making this point, because I know from my own experience in the past that a response has been, well, if there was no actual physical touching, if there was no actual physical sexual assault, it wasn't as important or as devastating. And yet, if you think about what it's like to force, or it might be like to force a child or a vulnerable adult to watch inappropriate images or to watch a sexual act happening, that is not potential, that's actual harm to those most vulnerable. If we ignore red flags, then we might increase the risk of actual or potential harm. That's a serious problem for us. If we ignore the risk, if we ignore the red flags, then we might increase the risk. Okay, it's really important to think about that. And as I said earlier, often when cases of abuse come into the public domain, those who held authority at the time, if they're not the accused, start to recognize that there were red flags evident in the behavior of the individual, but they were not seen, or indeed, if they were seen, they were ignored. So it might be useful to reflect on your own experience, on your own reading of what you have seen, read and heard of in the media about cases where things were ignored. There's a level at which sometimes, as well as human beings, in relation to concerns, we minimize them, but also we would rather not see them sometimes. And I can't remember if in this presentation I have written about bystanders, but I'm going to mention bystanders here. The alternative word for bystander is an observer. And how often does this happen in daily life? Something happens, something goes wrong, and we assume someone else will sort it. An example I used with the community at for a workshop in Nairobi last weekend was, you know, someone spills some water on the stairs. I'm sure that in most communities, someone would immediately see that there's a risk of someone falling and hurting themselves, so they would clean the spillage of water up. But how often in other contexts do we ignore something and think someone else can deal with it? So we know of situations where abuse has happened and abusive behavior has happened, and the response has been, well, surely that's someone else's duty to do something about it, or that person knows more about it. So we pass that responsibility on to others. So that's what being a bystander is about. So a bystander is someone who watches something and doesn't do anything about it. They hear about a safeguarding concern and they do nothing. And for me, the worst case scenarios are when those bystanders have already attended safeguarding training, and yet they still do nothing about it. They know about the responsibility, and the responsibility indeed comes with safeguarding training. It's not sufficient to have a safeguarding policy, gathering dust on a shelf. It's not sufficient to say everyone in my congregation has read the policy, everyone in my congregation has attended safeguarding training, and yet they do nothing. Those are the hardest moments for me, really, when I think that people, they've been given this gift and they don't see that they have to implement it. Having had safeguarding training should change how people work. It should change how people are engaged in ministry. So in safeguarding, we refer to low-level concerns. So think about some of the examples that we've had. I've given you already, even if in not necessarily a vague way, but think about some of the low-level concerns that happen. And hopefully you're already thinking about situations where maybe if someone had intervened, the outcome, even several years later, could have actually been different. So a low-level concern, and this is taken directly from the Farah and Co document. A low-level concern is any concern, no matter how small, and even if no more than causing a sense of unease or a nagging doubt that an adult may have acted in such a way that is inconsistent with the code of conduct, including inappropriate conduct outside the community. And how often sometimes can there be, even in maybe a relatively low-level concern manner, of having a double life of how one lives in community and how one lives outside? And why are we not often making this connection between safeguarding is not just something we do in ministry, in school, in hospitals, in retreat centres, in parish work, whatever ministry we are in, safeguarding isn't restricted to there. And then when we come home or we go back to our communities or our families, we don't need to think about how we behave with each other. I've used the story, so forgive me, some of you have heard me say this before, but community life and family life being such that there are moments when living together isn't always as harmonious as we might have hoped. And I'm sure some of you may have, a small number of you may have had the experience of living with a member of your community at a different time in your formation or in a different ministry, a different location, different province, wherever. And living with somebody who was quite challenging in their behavior, not always the easiest person to live with. And then you go out into the community, in your parish, and people ask you, they ask you where you're from, and they say, oh gosh, so you must be living with, and they name the person in your community. And then they say to you, it must be like living with a saint. You must be so privileged to live with that individual, okay? Whenever I've told this, I've never asked for examples, but I've often seen many, many men and women religious smiling and nodding their heads. So this must resonate with some people. This is about inappropriate conduct outside the community or inappropriate conduct inside the community. However, remember that we're talking about concerns, and concerns will not meet the allegation threshold. Okay, we'll talk later about what I mean by allegation threshold. So which essentially means it's not serious enough to consider a referral to the statutory authorities. Okay, but it may merit consulting with and seeking advice. This is critically important. It's about getting some help and talking it through. And Marcus Iroga, who is a very good speaker on this, he is one of the co-authors of the Farah and Co documents. He talks about the concept of a slippery slope of boundary violations towards abuse. I know we have some people here online from the US, and boundary violations, I believe, was coined by safeguarding in the US, and I do like it as a term. In terms of boundary violations, it sounds so serious, but he talks about stages on the slippery slope towards the breach of a boundary within a relationship. And you think about how that happens in ordinary friendships sometimes, or in work relationships, or in ministry relationships. A slippery slope starts to happen. The boundaries start to shift. The boundaries are not being held by one or indeed both partners in this pastoral relationship, for example. He says sometimes initial infringements are part of a grooming process. Okay, so sometimes that can be part of the deliberate manipulation. But he says at other times they are made innocently and with good intention. So let me go back to thinking about grooming sometimes being confused with kindness. If we all get too worried that actually, if we're being kind, someone might think we're grooming them, we're going to be a much, quite an unhappy world and much unhappier society, as it were, if we're going to go to that place of being suspicious. So he says at times people, they are made innocently and with good intention. People don't always realize what they're doing. So it's not, again, this is about intention. What's the intention? But he says, however, once boundaries are breached, it then becomes more difficult to restore the relationship to one in which proper boundaries are respected. And some of you, this will resonate with many of you online, where you've engaged in a friendship or in a pastoral relationship and boundaries were not kept well. And it's very difficult to go back again to restore the relationship to what it was. I would say that one positive step that someone might take in such circumstances is to have those difficult conversations. So what do we mean by boundaries? Are they physical, emotional, verbal boundaries and boundary violations? They are all those things. It's how we speak to others. It's how we are physically with them. It's how we are emotionally with them. And boundaries are not only about touch. Some of you will recognize this photograph from one of the shops in Rome. I photographed this a long time ago because I thought I'm bound to use it in a PowerPoint one day. Boundaries are not only about touch, okay, that's important, but boundaries are about touch, and we need to think about how do we respect touch. And again, I know this is a very cultural issue, and I'm very aware that in many countries, engaging in physical touch, embracing others, holding hands is very much part of the culture. And I'm not criticizing that. I'm saying we need to be aware. But boundaries are also about how we engage with others, verbally as well. And that's important. How might we be if we are intrusive with others? So if we educate, and again, this comes back from the Farah and Co document, if we educate adults to be informed about and to identify concerning, problematic, inappropriate behavior, rather than think They can recognize dangerous people. They can be prepared to act when they observe behavior which violates the agreed code of conduct. It's about observing and being curious, and if necessary, taking action. It is not about becoming a bystander or an observer, but it's also about good and appropriate record keeping. We might want to pick up on record keeping later. And this is what I've already told you about in terms of being a bystander. It's someone who's observed a safeguarding concern or heard about it or been informed or indeed even been involved in a safeguarding situation. And sadly, sometimes someone who has attended safeguarding training and knows what to do and does nothing. Okay, I don't know whether I should hand back to Sister Mary John at this point, but at this point, it is a time for personal reflection and discussion in groups. Thanks, Mary John. Thank you.
Very, very nice. You really shed light and clarity on a simple, common, everyday uses like concerns, no, which what it could mean in the safeguarding context. Thank you very much. We look forward to listening to you more. And friends, now we have half an hour. We have 30 minutes for personal reflection, work in groups, and for raising initial thoughts and questions. Tina had already shown the the points for personal reflection, or you could even surface examples. Our technicians will send us into groups. So we have 20 minutes for discussion in groups and 10 minutes to raise initial thoughts and questions. I guess, Tina, that's also done in the group. Or
Yes, if you want to in your groups, I think we have 10, when you come back, we have 10 minutes for questions and answers and feedback. So it would be lovely to have some questions.
Very good. Thank you and welcome back to the plenum. I'm sure the time in the groups was short. Some hardly managed to get into the group. Yeah. But anyway, never mind, because we are also a large group and we are dealing with this in different languages. So it's a little bit complex in that way, but never mind. Now for the next 10 minutes or so, we will take a few questions, some 2 or 3 questions that surfaced in your groups. We will not be able to do justice to all of you, but at the end we have the plenum. So another 30 minutes, maybe we can respond to more questions that time. So for now, you are open to raise your questions through chat, or chat may be better, or by show of emoji. So it's open before we have the next presentation.
Sister Mary John, we had
Yeah.
already one question from Casey
Okay.
in English on the chat.
All right. Yeah. Casey said, can you please explain the difference between policy and code of conduct? And if different, which informs which?
Okay, good. No, very good
Sure,
question.
Tina.
Thank you. Very good question, because someone recently said to me, what do we call our safeguarding? Do we call it a policy, a guidance document, a protocol? Okay, so whatever we call the safeguarding policy, whatever term you use, that is the policy which actually indicates what safeguarding means to your congregation. How do you implement it? How do you care for victims? How do you respond to concerns and allegations? How do you create safe places and safe people and safe activities? Those are some of the standards that I know many congregations are using now as a foundation for their safeguarding policy. That is the policy in the protocol. The code of conduct is about your conduct as an individual, in community, in ministry, in terms of your behavior? What do you commit to in terms of how you behave? So very, very different documents. But if the policy is about how we respond to the young and vulnerable, how we care for the young and vulnerable, how your charism influences your how you live, then the code of conduct should emerge from living out the policy, if that makes sense. But it's a good question.
Yeah, thank you, Tina. And there's just another interesting observation. In some cultures, it was taught that a man beating his wife was a sign of care or love. Similarly, beating children in school was interpreted as caring, teaching how acceptable as behavior. I guess this is what the cultural aspect of.
It's a very good question. It is, in some ways it's cultural, but I'm standing here in the UK, and I can put with some certainty that there will be many women being beaten by their husband in the UK and in Europe and in the US. This isn't a cultural. The beating of wives, which actually in some places is a criminal offence, is not necessarily a cultural issue. The beating of children is still evident in some cultures. I spent a lot of time and got into some difficulties in parts of Africa talking about this. But it is a crime in Kenya. Since 2022 in Kenya, it's a crime. And yet parents and teachers, and I have to say, and I'm ashamed to say this, some religious are still beating children. Where does Jesus talk about any sense of the importance of physically beating a child? And to keep this very short, and some of you, I know there are people here from the UK who've also had teaching careers. When I started teaching, it was acceptable that teachers beat children. We learned that actually didn't do anything other than instill fear. It didn't teach children how to behave. I was overjoyed to meet with a group of lay people working for Pauline Communications in Africa a few days ago, in person. They were all lay people, some married with children, and many of them spoke about they do not beat their children because they see the harm it does. And that did my heart good in a context where very often religious are saying parents want us to beat their children. We have to think about this as a crime. It's a form of abuse.
Yes, yeah.
It's very harmful.
Thank you, Tina.
I know
Terex,
it's controversial.
could you please read the one in French?
Yes, sister, I will. So in French, we have pourquoi malgré la bonne formation sur la prévention, il subsiste avec la peur de signaler, de faire des signalations des personnes suspectes. Alors, dans la formulation de la question, il semble que malgré la bonne formation sur la prévention, on continue à avoir peur de signaler les situations de ces personnes suspectes qui abusent des autres personnes. Voilà, ça c'est la première question en français. Je profite aussi pour présenter la question en italien. Nel nostro gruppo ci sono modi per fare, allora la domanda, ci sono modi per fare una verifica dei codici di condotta? Ecco, questa è la domanda anche in italiano. Un'altra domanda, posso Tina dire tutte le domande?
Yeah, okay.
Va bene, continuo allora con la terza
Yeah, we
domanda.
need to, yeah, but I've already, you've already given me two and I haven't been able to answer them.
Okay,
Yeah.
okay, good.
So just that very good question in terms of why we have good formation, we have good safeguarding training, are still people afraid? I think sometimes it's the lack of skill in difficult conversations. It's about not wanting to be, there's a perception of maybe if I speak, I will be disloyal to my friends who I was in formation with, who I'm very close to. We have to think about what the intention is. What's the real intention again? This is about preventing harm to the young and vulnerable. And some people have said to me, well, I just won't report. well, that means that you are holding responsibility for that allegation. And repeatedly, in my experience internationally, those who know are being held accountable by civil law and by canon law. I know of situations where some are under criminal investigation. They did not abuse, but they knew and they did not do what they had to do. With leadership comes a heavy burden of responsibility, and I am not underestimating the cost, because I see that cost in those with whom I live and work in this safeguarding world. It's a heavy cost, but it is an aspect of leadership. And if in leadership, or whether if it's just a fellow colleague, a fellow religious who knows and they do nothing about it, they are being held accountable. There are enough high-profile cases coming out of the Vatican to tell us that. It's a good question. I think there's a lot of fear. And I would add to that, why is it that in some countries, including the UK, people have had very good religious priests, have had very good safeguarding training, and yet they still go on to abuse. So I think there's a lot of work we need to do to try and understand the dynamic.
Yeah. Thank you, Tina. There are many more questions. I am sure friends keep asking those questions, and some of them you will be answering in your next presentations, no? So
Yeah.
shall we move to the second part of your presentation of another 30 minutes, responding to allegations. So concerns and allegations. Now it is over to Tina.
Thank you. Okay, hopefully everyone can see that. There are lots of questions about this, I'm sure, and we will do our best. I'll do my best to make sure we have time at the end as well. So this is where we got to. Before the break. So let's move on to think about how we define the word allegation. I think it's very, very important that we are very clear about the language and terminology that we use. Okay, it's very important. I know in some contexts, and I've seen in some safeguarding policies, people don't use the word, well, they don't use the word concerns at all. They are sometimes not addressed at all. And instead of allegation, they use the word complaint. I think that minimalizes the impact for victims. You know, if my flight is delayed or if my train is cancelled, I might make a complaint. But if we're talking about someone who has been sexually, physically, spiritually, emotionally abused by a member of the church, calling it a complaint, I think minimalizes it. So I think we have to be clear about this is an allegation. I also would advise against a terminology which I've heard coming out of one country, where they use the term credible allegations. So they make decisions about whether or not the allegation is true. My view on this, after many years working in this field, is that we are not forensic specialists. We are not police officers. I realize there is at least one retired police officer taking part in this webinar this afternoon, but it is not our role to investigate. That's why we have the statutory authorities. And the passing on of that information is critically important in relation to allegations. But how do we define it? An allegation is a statement or report that someone has said or done something which is seriously wrong. Okay, so we're not talking about a concern, an unease, a nagging doubt. We are talking about something which is seriously wrong. And it might also be a criminal act. In the church, sexual abuse is a criminal act. But some allegations, whilst serious, are not always criminal. For example, spiritual abuse is yet to be regarded as criminal. I was quite heartened over the weekend to read that this is being reconsidered at the Vatican in terms of the impact, recognizing the impact of spiritual abuse on children and adults. and that there will be a move towards criminalizing it. I suspect it's more likely, and I'm aware there's at least one canon lawyer in this webinar as well, it's more likely to be strongly criminalized under canon law, as it were. But be aware that some allegations, whilst not serious, are not always criminal. However, it's very important that you have access to good, safeguarding people that you can seek advice from. Okay, I think it's very important, and not make a decision based on, well, we weren't sure, so we decided not to do anything, because not doing anything can actually implicate you in being responsible and accountable for failing to do anything. So, as I said, not all allegations are criminal in terms of civil law, and for example, spiritual abuse. So it means that some allegations are considered under canon law. But remember that when one form of abuse happens, often many others are also present. For example, sexual abuse in a church context includes spiritual abuse. And many of you will know this because some of you have heard me talk about this. The perpetrator of abuse uses cognitive distortions to justify her or his actions in relation to the sexual abuse of a child or a vulnerable adult. Those cognitive distortions are often based on claiming that God had told them to do this, or they are doing God's work by abusing another. Now, some of you might find that very difficult to understand, but this is exactly how a perpetrator of abuse uses cognitive distortions to justify their actions. Cognitive distortions in themselves are quite complex and are worthy of a whole separate webinar, but we don't have time. But it's important to remember that sexual abuse in a church context includes that spiritual element, but also physical and emotional abuse. Okay, so it's important to remember there are many other forms of abuse that happen and not just one form on its own. So what's an allegation? The term allegation means that it is alleged that a person, an adult or a child, and it's important to remember that we are becoming increasingly aware of child-on-child abuse. Formerly, this was known as peer-on-peer abuse. So we must remember that both men, women, and children can actually sexually abuse, or in other ways abuse others. But it means that they have displayed or acted in such a way behavior which has harmed a child or a vulnerable adult, behavior which indicates the person may have harmed a child or vulnerable adult, or possibly committed a criminal offence against or related to a child or a vulnerable adult. Importantly to remember, an allegation is a very serious matter. And people ask me very often how to deal with allegations. How do we deal with case management of the accused? One of the difficulties is that every situation is different. There are certain steps that we have to take which are a given. They shouldn't be doubted at all. But actually, in other ways, there are other things that can be very different. So an allegation can arrive in person. It can be, you can be here, receive it directly from a victim, or indeed victims. We need to be mindful that some perpetrators of abuse will abuse several children or several vulnerable adults. It could be a third party, perhaps on the behalf of the victim. It could be by letter, email, phone call, or even anonymously. Sometimes it can come directly from the police or another authority. They will inform you that they are aware of allegations. Very rarely does it come from the perpetrator of the abuse. In my experience, it's very unlikely that a perpetrator of abuse is going to come and confess to their superior, their provincial, their bishop. It does happen. I know of situations where it does happen, has happened, but it's very rare. Many allegations will be what we term non-recent. Otherwise, they can be known. Non-recent can also be defined as historical or sometimes termed legacy cases. Okay, The fact that they are non-recent and historical does not devalue the impact for a victim. And many of you, if not all of you, will understand why victims delay in disclosing their abuse for many, many reasons. I've included this paragraph from a book by Sarah Good, although it's nearly 15 years old now. I like it because it really is a good reminder to all of us. It's from her book called Understanding and Addressing Adult Sexual Attraction to Children. That in itself is a concept which some of us might struggle to understand. She says paedophiles exist, and we know them and are very fond of them. They live in our communities and are members of our family, our friends, our work colleagues. They are in our churches and other religious settings. They are in positions of trust and authority. Quite often, they may be involved in looking after our children. They may even be involved in child protection issues. They may well not be exclusively sexually attracted to children. They may form relationships with women. She's talking here about men. Join families, form new families, and parent children. I think for me that captures what we are very aware of in the church. When we hear of yet another abuse crisis, another abuse case, many people will say, but I thought that person was such a good person. I worked with that person. I never knew what they would be like. I never knew about them. I never suspected. Or the worst case scenarios are when people say, I did wonder if something was wrong or they were doing something they shouldn't be doing in terms of how I observed they were relating to children or vulnerable adults. But it's a good reminder, really, that we cannot always identify those who are going to do harm. And indeed, people who do harm in this way often do much good as well. So how do we respond to the person who brings the allegations? The person might be the victim, or the person might be someone speaking on behalf of the victim. Getting it right in terms of responding is extremely important. Many of you will know and recognize this pattern, and certainly those of you who have ever been in any safeguarding training in Scotland will recognize this, because this was framed as a way of responding in Scotland in the Catholic Church a long time ago. I use it in all my training because I think it's a very sound process. So many of you will know how to do this, but this is a reminder as well. It's about listen, respond, record, and refer. Okay, 4 very clear actions. In terms of listening, I would always check if the allegation has already been reported and to whom, because some victims or some who are related to victims sometimes need to talk about the abuse, and they might need to talk about it again when other triggers happen in their own personal life or through the media, which actually brings that abuse to the surface. So listen with your ears and with your heart. Be attentive. Okay, so as far as possible, not to have anything which interrupts your time with the person. Set a boundary on that time as well. Be attentive and appreciate how difficult this might be for the other person. Very often when people are talking about trauma, and when they're talking about the trauma of having been sexually abused, they will go back to the age at which they were abused, psychologically and sometimes in their behavior. So you might have someone in front of you who is in their 50s, but actually how they are feeling and where they are psychologically and in terms of accessing their trauma, they are back to when they were abused at 10 or 11. And take time for people as well. Okay, it's really important to give them time. But as I said earlier, boundary to time. And respond by reassuring the person they have done the right thing. It's not easy for a victim to come forward and talk about what's happened to them. They will feel often very unsafe. They will feel very strong emotion, or indeed no emotion at all. They might be numb. They will wonder whether they can trust you. They will wonder what you are going to do with this information. So reassure them, be patient, but keep yourself safe too. Do not ask intrusive questions. Only ask questions to clarify, just to check that you understand what the information is that they're giving to you. Do not make promises or guess at information. And I've known situations where victims have come forward to people in the church, people in safeguarding, and said, you know, I want the priest to go to prison. And they've been told, oh, yes, that will happen. You know, that's guessing, that's making promises, not based on information. If possible, also provide a victim support leaflet. I would encourage all of you, in line with your policies, your safeguarding policies, to have a victim support leaflet ready. Don't be hesitant and think, well, we have no victims in my congregation or in my province or in my country or in my diocese. It's good to have one ready. Very often when victims come and speak, they are so traumatized and anxious, they may not remember some of the information you give them. I have sometimes spoken to victims, or they contacted me to say, I went and spoke to someone, and I'll say, well, do you know who it was? And they'll say, no, they couldn't remember the name of the person or the role the person has. So the victim support leaflet should be reminding them what the next steps might be, and also giving them information about resources and other sources of help outside the church as well for them. And record, make notes immediately make notes either during or immediately afterwards. Remember, your notes might be used as evidence. You might have to pass those notes on to the police. Do not record the meeting on your mobile or any other device, because it will probably be taken away as evidence, and you could be without that for quite a long time. If you have specific safeguarding recording forms, which I hope you do, for the recording of allegations, transfer your notes to the relevant form. Refer to your safeguarding policy regarding whether the record is to be signed by the person you have met with. Remember, this isn't about taking a statement. This is a first disclosure of what's happened to them. And then refer. To whom do you refer that the allegation is dependent upon your role and should be explicitly stated in your safeguarding policy? So your safeguarding policy should identify the key roles and structures in relation to safeguarding. So, for example, do you refer to your safeguarding delegate or lead? I'm sure you all in every province or entity or delegation in your congregation or parish, in your diocese or in your parish, you have a safeguarding delegate. If you're the delegate, do you refer it to your provincial? Is the requirement that you report directly to the police? Or does someone else hold that responsibility? Also consider the civil and canonical requirements for mandatory reporting. Excuse me. There is a requirement for mandatory reporting in Vos Estis Lux Mundi, so think about that. Also think about the implications in Code of Canon Law Book 6 for religious and for lay people in positions of authority and responsibility in the church. And then who informs your insurance company of the allegation? Who is responsible for doing that? Because insurance companies need to know immediately there is an allegation. They don't need to know the details or the full details, but they do need to know. So it's important to think about how you manage these allegations and how you respond to them. Now we're running slightly ahead of time. Yes, having started to run late, so we should be having a break. What I'm going to suggest is, because we have
Actually, we are just exact. You all had a very good coffee, tea, break, or lunch, as the case may be. We noticed that there are some very good questions, comments, and even some requests in the chat. and you will have many in your heart to ask. We can't take up everything, but we will surely take those questions, and with Tina, she will try to put them together, some of those questions, and get back to you, some of it in the plenum, and the rest maybe, we have more webinars coming up, so we will try. We could have a webinar only on questions and requests like that, because this is such a large topic and a very engaging topic. For now, we will go to our third presentation, which is a short one of 15 minutes, where Tina will speak to us on putting red flags into practice. We saw some red flags on the earlier slides. So, Tina, to you.
Okay, so hopefully, as Mary Jo said, you all managed to have some sort of quick break. I'm going to show you now a real life case study. It is again taken from the Farah and Co. Document, which I've referenced several times already today. These case studies, some of you have seen some of them before. These are very, very useful because they are true case studies, okay? And they are very helpful, I think, for us in understanding red flags. They're not happening in a church context, which is also sometimes useful for us. But let's start. So the first one is about a male drama teacher. So this is a true story. In a state primary school for children aged 4 to 11 years old in the United Kingdom. As I said earlier, in the Farah and Co. document, really most of the case studies, because it is written in England, most of the case studies are taken from cases which have happened in the UK. But there's still much we can learn from them. He abused girl pupils in the school between 2003 to 2009. Now, in some respects, that's a long time ago. In other respects, it isn't. It isn't. When safeguarding was in place in schools before then. But you will see from this case study why the situation wasn't managed better and wasn't dealt with appropriately. He joined the school as a newly qualified teacher. He was what we would define a mature newly qualified teacher. He completed suicide when he was due for trial in 2010, when he was aged 56. And he was known to have abused girls between 2003 and 2009. So those girls are now they're young adult women now, and where I don't know what support was provided for them. There's no reason why I would know that, but I wonder how they felt when he actually took his own life before the trial was due to happen. Concerns about his behavior were raised in 1998, which was the year he joined the school. So immediately on joining the school, concerns were raised about his behavior. I forgot to mention, and some of you will know this, he ran a drama club as a drama teacher. One thing drama teachers can do without anyone necessarily questioning is that they can actually touch children. They can move a child and say, no, stand here, no, turn there, no, come stand over wherever. Okay, and it's justified. And I wonder how much he used that touch to test the resilience of a child, or not the resilience in terms of whether they didn't feel comfortable with him or not. He was charged with 25 offences against 4 girls, 25 offences. He set up and led this prestigious drama club, and he used it to test out the resistance of children he targeted for abuse. We don't get the detail, in the report. However, I'm guessing that with some of those girls, when he put his arm around them or put his hands around their waist, for example, they might have stepped away and indicated they didn't want that to happen. And others may have not thought anything about that being touched by him. As a teacher, he was difficult to manage. He flouted school rules, he ignored school rules. His lessons were known to lack structure. The girls' victims were under 13 years old, and the youngest was 9. He was known to have favourites amongst the children, and pupils were aware that the teacher had access to a large knife used in drama productions. So the implication there is that he was possibly using that as a threat to them. But pupils sought status through selection for roles in the drama club. He no doubt promised them all sorts of things, like they would appear on television, or they would become famous, or they'd be starring in a film. The pupils were told that the teacher would go to prison if they disclosed the abuse, and no one would then be able to look after his disabled wife. So he silenced the girls in terms of saying he had this large knife and they knew it. And he also silenced them by saying if they told anyone about the abuse, no one would look after his disabled wife because he would be in prison. Now, you all know that it's not unusual for a perpetrator of abuse to use threats to silence their victims. We don't know if there was a disabled wife at all, but he obviously used this again as a form of manipulation. In terms of his colleagues in the school, the head teacher and colleagues found the drama teacher difficult. He instilled fear in other teaching staff through his behaviour, like shouting at them. Staff expressed concerns about him and his relationships with pupils in the drama club. An anonymous referral about him was made to the head teacher of the school. So already we see a chaotic picture. We see him frightening staff. We see him, in a sense, frightening his victims and other children in the drama club, and yet they wanted to be there. And now there is a referral about his behaviour, which is made to the head teacher. Amongst the reported concerns included suspicious photographs on the school computer, which he used. He also showed a 15-rated DVD with explicit sex scenes to Year 5 pupils. They were 9-year-old girls and boys. This concern was reported by the parent of another child. 2 teachers attended safeguarding training and informed the head teacher that this drama teacher ticks all the boxes of the training exercise, which was called the profile of an abuser. So you have 2 staff going away and going to safeguarding training and coming back and saying that they are aware now of just the implications of the behaviour of the drama teacher. The period of offending spanned the time of 2 head teachers. The weak leadership of the first head teacher and personal distractions of the second one fostered a culture where safeguarding was not taken seriously. Lack of record keeping meant patterns of behaviour were not identified. So some of those concerns raised against the teacher may well not have been recorded. However, parents were desperate for their children to get into the drama club, and he used the drama club to foster strong relationships with parents. So he's manipulating the parents as well as the children. Eventually, the teacher was suspended. The parents petitioned for the teacher to return to school when suspended. And I find that absolutely remarkable. A teacher has been suspended for inappropriate behaviour for safeguarding concerns involving children in the school, and the parents petitioned for him to be returned to teaching. And no surprise, the teacher had strong backing from the governing body, the management of the school, making it difficult for the second head teacher to challenge him. So he's been grooming the parents, grooming the victims, and indeed grooming the governing body of the school. So we're going to have a go at identifying red flags, okay? So red flags can involve concerns, but also clearly actual allegations of harm as well. But let's start by looking at some of the concerns. So he joined the school as a newly qualified teacher, completed suicide when due for trial, known to have abused girls, and concerns about his behaviour were raised the year he joined the school. So look at the red flags here. He set up this drama club, which he used to test out the resistance of children he targeted for abuse. Imagine someone actually thinking, I'm going to set up an activity with children where I can test the resistance of children that I want to abuse. That's a red flag. Difficult to manage. He flouted or ignored or challenged school rules. Lessons were known to lack structure. Another red flag. He was known to have favourites amongst the children. That in itself is not a red flag, but in this context, it certainly is a red flag. Pupils were aware that he had access to a large knife used in drama productions. It's a red flag. They sought status through selection for roles in the drama club. Another red flag. They were told that he would go to prison if they disclosed the abuse, and no one would look after his disabled wife. Another red flag. Teachers, the head teacher and colleagues found him difficult. It's a red flag. The teacher instilled fear in other teaching staff through his behaviour. I'm guessing this was a sort of scenario where, you know, in schools, sometimes, very often, it's important that staff support each other. And they may well have, somebody may well have walked past his classroom and heard a lot of noise, which wouldn't be unusual in a drama class, and may have put their head in and said, is everything all right? And he just shouted at them. So he stopped staff having any sense of what was happening in his lessons. They expressed concerns about him and his relationship with pupils. A red flag. The referral made to the head teacher is another red flag. The suspicious photographs on the school computer is another red flag. The showing a 15-rated DVD with explicit sex scenes to year 5, 9-year-old pupils is a red flag. I have to say, I'm very surprised he was not suspended for that. The concern was reported by the parent of another child, a red flag. The teachers who went on the safeguarding training came back and told the head teacher that they thought, you know, there were enough concerns about the drama teacher, another red flag. And the weak leadership of the first head teacher, distractions of the second one, the lack of record keeping, all red flags. The grooming of the parents is a red flag. The parents petitioning for him to return to school is a red flag. And the fact that he groomed the governing body is a red flag. And what's important to notice is how many red flags there are and how many of them were ignored. Now, eventually, of course, he was arrested. He was charged, and when he was due to go to trial, as I've already explained, he ended his life by suicide. But think about the red flags which indicated concerns, serious concerns, and were ignored. And if they hadn't been ignored, if they had been acted on, just think about the harm that could have been prevented in terms of those what are now young women, in terms of the impact on their lives. So key reminders. It's important to have good, professional, relevant safeguarding training for everyone on an annual basis. And by everyone, I mean everyone, even in formation. I'm working quite a lot now and frequently meeting with formators. And many of them do have good programs of safeguarding information, and some of them are not doing anything at all. It should happen throughout someone's life and ministry. Creating and living out the code of conduct in line with your safeguarding policy the ability to see red flags, have difficult conversations, and indeed challenge low-level concerns and poor boundaries. Somebody's asked about in the chat about difficult conversations. There are ways to have difficult conversations which shouldn't necessarily make them antagonistic. Okay, it's very important to have these difficult conversations. And again, that skill should start in formation. It should start in seminaries. The ability to prevent a bystander response to safeguarding concerns and allegations. Let's stop being a bystander and thinking it's someone else's responsibility to do something about abuse or to report it, and actually accept the responsibility which comes with leadership. Together, we can collaborate to create a culture of care, protection, and prevention. But we have to do this together, and we shouldn't be in situations where we are battling to remind others of the duties involved in the safeguarding policy. That this is what we do. It should be part of our DNA. This is our gospel call to love others. It should be how we live. It should be how we love. Thank you.
Thank you, Tina, for presenting so well that real case life situation studies on the red flags that we often ignore. Sadly, such scenario, such similar cases are only too often found in our surroundings, and also how alarming it is that when we even the different actors and the factors that contribute to this, coming to such a proportion. Yeah.
Yeah,
Thank you
absolutely.
so much for that presentation. And now we have exactly 30 minutes for questions, comments, and other interventions that you please. Therese, and please help me also with reading some of the things from
Si.
the chat. Thank you. Tina, there were some of, as you said, I don't know, would you like to begin with some of those on the difficult conversations? There is one uncomfortable conversations.
Yes, there is. It's not terribly difficult, really, but there is a whole process, a very simple process. But this is like another webinar, where about having difficult conversations. How do we have those? Think about even. Okay, I do know this. It's not just I think it, but we are all affected by our family of origin. Okay, so in our family of origin, if we came from a family of origin, if any of you come from a family of origin where difficult conversations happened, things were discussed as a family, arguments happened and were resolved. Or if you come from a family where there were no arguments and things were not discussed openly, that affects us as adults in terms of how we manage these difficult conversations. So I think it's really important that we develop these skills in the young men and women who are coming into formation, coming into seminaries. So they learn this skill, even if from their family of origin, it might feel uncomfortable to suddenly now behave in a different way. But I think it's important. So often things are not addressed because we want to live in communities of loving kindness and not have disharmony. Or if we do have disharmony, we don't address it. It's just an unspoken.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you. You can also show your hand to make if you want to speak, to unmute and.
Il y a une question en français, en espagnol que j'ai pu traduire en français. Je vais la lire. La personne dit,
Okay,
je
thank you.
pense que bien souvent, l'agresseur d'enfants ou de personnes vulnérables n'est pas une personne qui apparaît par hasard dans la vie de ces personnes, de ces enfants, mais c'est une personne qui occupe une position ou une responsabilité à l'égard de l'enfant. Alors, comment peut-on dissocier l'abus de la dépendance dans laquelle vivent ces enfants ou ces adultes vulnérables? La dépendance peut-elle être à la base de la dissimulation de l'abus? Voilà, voilà la question qui a été faite en espagnol. Je ne sais pas, Tina, si...
Abuse.
Very good question. And two things. One is the whole act of grooming, of manipulation, is to encourage dependence. Even though that dependency can, from you use the word aggressor, but from the perpetrator, that the acts of sexual abuse can be both violent, and 1 minute they're kind, and then the next minute they're threatening them, and the next minute they're giving gifts. That's that ambivalence, which the closest parallel that we can maybe identify with is domestic violence, where people remain in that relationship even though they're being beaten and humiliated. And also the other point about talking about dependence is that when children and adults with disabilities clearly have they have needs and great dependencies, so they need to be helped. And that can be covered. It's not unusual. And again, we know cases like this, which have been very public, where children and adults with disabilities, people have been drawn to help them. People who want to harm have been drawn to help them. And that's why we need to be very vigilant and very strong in our safeguarding policies about safe recruitment of people and training for people, because it's too easy to think, well, isn't it wonderful these people want to volunteer, when actually the potential is that they might well cause harm.
Thank you. There's also one on how to deal with frightening language and behavior of sister in a community. Is this low-level concern?
It can sometimes be quite a high-level concern for those who have to live with it. I'm sure that resonates with some people. This goes back to, yes, it is a concern, but it goes back to the code of conduct. Is this really how we want to, in those circumstances, people want to live in community? It's very important to think about that. And to challenge it as well, gently, but yeah.
Not easy.
No, it's not easy.
Ci sono due persone che chiedono la possibilità di parlare. Pastor James?
Okay.
Father
Hello,
James.
James. Good to see you.
Hello.
And after that, Sister Felicia.
Thanks. I remember your classes in the IEDC diploma.
Yes, I know. I remember you in the diploma class. The only UK person who's done the diploma.
Yeah, there should be more. And the only one, I don't know if any from Scotland, but anyway. Okay, so my question, just try and be brief because there's others who'd like to ask. Earlier on in your first presentation, you were talking about low-level concerns. And on one of the slides, you're quoting, I think, Cave and others, you mentioned this component of an emotional component. So my question is this. In community life, where low-level concerns are raised about emotional behaviors which are harmful or unhealthy to other members, traditionally, these have often been accepted as part of the person's character, and often lots of justification, spiritualized. You have to carry the cross of this member, and sometimes it may have been valid, but in other cases, it meant that people got away with things that they shouldn't. If this has been mentioned already in communities and mentioned to superiors and nothing's being done, my question is this. So what's the point of recognizing low-level behaviors when it comes to emotional disturbances in the context of a spiritual abuse? Does it mean that we really need to work hard to change our cultures and look for this conversion in our religious communities? Do we have to get external assessment and help to see what's actually going on? Any suggestions?
Yeah, I think it's critically important that we do not ignore it. For decades, the dismissal of they've always been like this, they're too old to change now, they don't mean any harm. And actually, if it's causing harm to someone else, it is harmful behavior. And if it's again in breach of the code of conduct, that's critically important. Why have a code of conduct about how we live? Why have a charism in a religious congregation if that is not how people live? You know, how often is the charism ignored? And I see this in congregations where I've worked with so many congregations now in writing their policy with them. And suddenly that realization of this is in our charism. This isn't something new. This is what we should be doing and how we should be living. So it is important to challenge this.
Thank you.
But
Thank you,
also
Tina.
it becomes imitative behavior. I hear this as well. You know, junior sisters treated like slaves, and thinking that when I'm a professed sister, I also can treat juniors like this. So there's a lot of work we need to do in community.
There are three
Actually,
more or four more hands I see. Christian and then Michael and then Felicia and Josephine as they appear on the screen. Maybe there are
Okay.
more. So Christian. Please unmute. Yeah.
You're muted. Oh, you're unmuted now.
You're
Okay.
right. You're right.
buen día, ¿qué tal? Hay una línea muy delgada entre el abuso de poder y el tema laboral, ¿no? Porque una cosa es llamar la atención a un subordinado, no el empleador, a un empleado, pero también se podría decir si este empleador es un clérigo, un hermano, un religioso, es una línea muy delgada que cómo puede señalarse en el código de conducta. Eso también lo podemos ver también entre un profesor que motiva a un alumno y maltrata a un alumno. Entonces, puede haber un abuso de poder o puede ser una actitud no tan consecuente con la enseñanza. Entonces, quisiera delimitar cómo se puede consignar este código de conducta y delimitar esa línea delgada que puede haber. Muchas gracias.
I think I totally agree with you. It should help us define it, but I would also again go back to intention. You know, what is the intention of what is asked of others? And is it done respectfully? You know, is it done again in line with your charism, or the way in which you would expect to have been treated or be treated is important.
Okay. Michael.
Thank you. Hi. It's more of an observation, really. You might have a comment, Tina. So I've often been an employee of congregations, and so I often find congregations are their main priority is loyalty, collegiality for the good of the congregation. But it can mean sometimes great discretion and to protect the congregation. But then as an employee, the danger is that can mean there isn't straightforward communication. It may not be open, which makes it harder then. So you can feel as an outsider. And then literally it can take a year or two just to build up ordinary human trust with the individuals you work with. And then doors begin to open and trust builds, which is fortunate when you have a job to do. So I think it's true generally, but particularly in difficult issues like financial or safeguarding, of course. So it's more of an observation, really. So it's a big issue.
Yes.
Thank you, Michael. Thank you. Felicia?
I'm glad that I came after the last speaker because mine is really related to finance and how the same dynamic can happen if somebody is embezzling money, and they can present themselves as having a very big link to somebody high up, which makes one a bit fearful of reporting anything. Also, a small question, asking them something, a person will get blown out of the room with shouting, things like that. So I just don't know whether you have any advice on how to deal with finding out if this person does have very strong links, or is a relation or a big friend of someone else, just like that case you mentioned where the wife was supposed to be disabled. Nobody could find out whether the wife was disabled or not. I don't know if you have any answers. Thank you.
I mean, how you find out these things is probably very complex and fraught with difficulties. But the point you've made, actually, Felicity, is a very good one within what you've asked, because we talk often now in safeguarding about upward grooming. So people upwardly groom, so they make sure that they are close friends to people in authority, people who have power, people who have status. So then if something happens and they are accused, those who surround them are these people, very strong, important people who will say, how can you say that about this person? You know, they're a good person. They can't possibly be doing. So exactly as that drama teacher did, he upwardly groomed to try and protect himself when he was abusing those children. It's not an unusual behavior in perpetrators of abuse. But I think it's important to be very cautious then, and to make sure we go through safe recruitment, whether it's a volunteer gardener or it's somebody who helps in the house. I was delighted in Nairobi to be working with a group of lay people who did everything for a particular religious congregation in the province. I had the driver, the gardeners, the finance people. They were all told they had to have mandatory safeguarding training. And I think it's important, then it's seen as everyone's responsibility and not just the responsibility of one or two people.
Okay, we move to the next person, Josephine. And there was somebody else, Andrew or something, had hands up. Yeah.
Thank you very much for the presentation that you have shared with us. In relation to what the teacher kind of abused the children in the school, my concern is general. I'm concerned with this situation whereby in countries where there has been war, you see that many girls and women have been abused in different ways, majorly sexually abused. And I would like to know, is there any way the officers in concern with the gender-based violence support in such situations? Thank you.
There are, I mean, actually, I would suggest, I don't know, Mary John, if you can put Josephine in touch with people linked to the UISG, like Talitha Combe. There are many, thank God, really good, generous people working with young women and girls in these sort of situations. There are some very good church-run charities and independent charities.
Yeah, sure. Thank you. Anne?
Hi, Tina. It's lovely to meet you. I have a question about the example you gave, the red flags. If this teacher if somebody had reacted more quickly to the red flags, there would never have actually been maybe an accusation made against him. My question would be, they might have just, would they be able to dismiss him as a teacher without any accusation? If they could, would he not just go to the next school? Maybe the abuses would have been less in each school, but they might have happened. How when reacting to red flags, how do you actually deal with
when the difficulty with red flags is often they can be retrospective as well, which was the case in that one. It was repeated. I mean, he did the upward grooming, he manipulated, he groomed, and he used threats, as you know, but also certain things that he did now. And then if the school had been operating a proper safeguarding policy, I mean, no teacher in the you know, in any sense of having a good practice, would show a DVD with sexual scenes to a group of 9-year-old children, because I haven't been teaching for a while, so in schools in the UK, so don't quote me in terms of, I don't know what the current law would be in terms of HR, but that certainly is a suspendable offence, if not a sackable offence. And then he would not be given a reference to go to the next school. And we also have a system in England and in Wales and Scotland in relation to police checks. So if people breach safeguarding, you know, in terms of the abuse of children and harm for children, and they're seen as a risk, they can be barred from working with children or adults or both. And that's a state provision which the church fully concedes with. It's people can't be in ministry or do even volunteering roles without those police checks. But it's worrying because there will be other country contexts where that isn't available. But it's a good point. Thank you, Anne.
Thank you. We'll take one last intervention from Nirmal Gomes, and then we go to the questions, because there are, from the chat, there are so many very important questions. At least some of them we could take. Nirmal?
Thank you for giving me the opportunity. Hi, Tina.
Hi, Nirmal. Well, I can't see you, but it's nice that you're here. Oh, I can see you now. Good.
Thank you for being my teacher once again. Last year I got you. My concern is why the principals in the schools or the superiors in the community or the provincials in the province or the ordinaries in the dioceses always feel like not easy or not always welcoming to listen to the low level concerns, and then this low level concerns becomes the high level concern and the scandal is all over. So how can we motivate them or to educate them to take it seriously?
It's a brilliant question, Nirmal, because it's repeatedly happening. I think we have walked so far along a certain journey, and I think, oh gosh, you know, this is great. There's areas of growth and development. And then suddenly I'm confronted with another situation of a refusal to report, I'm talking about abuse, or a refusal to tackle difficult behavior. And someone in the questions, the chat said, you know, in the past, difficult people would have just been moved to another community, or indeed, you know, not in a community, to a ministry where they wouldn't have to live a communal life. That doesn't solve anything. It still keeps happening. And I think this is why the training of those in leadership is critically important. Very often training is seen to be something that others do, because those in leadership, sometimes they're too busy. It's not always deliberate. They're too busy. They are too busy to do this, you know, and they think, actually, I'll delegate this to someone else. No, that's not a criticism, but actually, if leadership are not trained, how will they know what to do? We've got a lot of work to do, I think.
Okay. So we'll take some questions from the chat, because they say somebody has said more than 25 questions are pending questions. Some of them can be put together, but Tina, would you like to address some of them? You have already answered some of them in some ways, and then we get back to other.
Yeah, I'll answer one that came in, if you don't mind, that came in at quite early on from someone who said about and it was before I'd got onto allegations, but they said, if a priest is accused, why is it a concern for a sister to still go to that priest for spiritual direction or spiritual exercises? And I would strongly say it's not a low-level concern, it's a very serious concern. If someone has been accused of abuse or a behavior which means that he should not be in ministry, that means all ministry, and it doesn't mean just to be allowed to do something like offer spiritual direction to someone. Earlier, someone mentioned about, I think it may have been Michael actually, talking about the abuse of power. All abuse is an abuse of power. Spiritual abuse is an abuse of power. Sexual abuse is an abuse of power. And it's a huge risk to say that someone is allowed to do certain ministries if they are accused and under investigation. Now, I don't want to know who that is, and I don't know the details.
Thank you,
It's
Tina.
important to be aware of that. And I'm just
Yeah.
looking.
There was also one in Spanish which read also to the same effect that abuse
Sí.
of power in communities.
Mhm. Yes, and I'd already mentioned about
Yes.
in situations where junior sisters are treated, in a sense of servitude. So someone has asked about children have to be introduced to identify red flags. And I think that's right, actually. In fact, children would quite enjoy, not that exercise with the abuse of the drama teacher, but they would enjoy understanding red flags in terms of appropriate behavior in class or in the playground and so on. I'm often in company with religious who are very aware of red flags, and they remind me about the fact that they can recognize red flags. And as much as we might smile about it, it is important, very important.
En français, j'ai une question. Alors,
Okay.
je vais. La violence symbolique peut-elle être considérée comme une forme de harcèlement? Quelles sont les similitudes et les différences entre les deux concepts? Ça, c'était traduit. Je vais dire une autre question. C'est possible?
So the beginning bit there was about violence.
La violence symbolique peut-elle être considérée comme une forme de harcèlement? Quelles sont les similitudes et les différences entre les deux concepts? La concept
I
de...
need to know more about what the person means by symbolic violence.
Ça, c'était une question traduite du espagnol, il me semble. Alors, la personne qui l'a posée, si elle peut s'expliquer. Autrement, entre-temps, je vais vous poser l'autre question. Comment faire la différence entre la manipulation et la gentillesse? Parce qu'en Afrique, l'aîné est très respecté par rapport à un enfant. Devons-nous dire que c'est un abus de pouvoir? Voilà.
No, I know about the respect of elders in Africa. It's the same in India as well, as many of you will know. The distinction between kindness and grooming is often difficult to recognize. However, the intention behind grooming is to isolate the victim, the child or the vulnerable adult, to use gifts and threats as well, to gain control of them, to gain dependency, so they become dependent on you. And the intention is then usually to sexually abuse. Very rarely, it might be, for example, with a vulnerable adult, an older adult, it might be financial abuse. But inevitably with children, it is to sexually abuse. And then we talk about a fifth, or some, not me, but some recent research talks about a fifth stage in the grooming process, which is maintenance, which means being able to still continue to abuse the child without the child disclosing what's happening, and doing that through the use of threats and bribes. So that ambivalence in the perpetrator is very difficult for a child to understand, but because they have a strong connection and a strong bond, the abuse is able to be maintained, to be continued. And as difficult as this might be for some of you, there will be others on this webinar who know this, painfully know this. A victim often loves their perpetrator. They love their perpetrator, and they will do anything to protect their perpetrator. And that's very difficult, perhaps, to understand. But that is another indicator of the difference between grooming and kindness. It's all about dependency, manipulation, and harm.
Thank you. Thank you, Tina. There are so many other questions. Maybe there is one hand up from Sister Balvina. We will be, with that, I think we will close this question session, moments. And
Sí.
then because we are running out of time
Muchas
also, yeah.
por-
Balbina?
Sí, gracias. Mi pregunta, un comentario. Para quienes ya tenemos el protocolo de conducta y hemos tenido una formación continua, por lo menos cada año al inicio, sobre retomar el tema de la prevención y de todo esto que hoy estamos hablando. ¿Qué otras prácticas podríamos implementar para prevenir estas zonas que hoy mirábamos como zonas de peligrosas, como zonas grises, que podrían ser como potencialmente mucho más riesgosas a futuro? Entonces, como prácticas más concretas que podemos hacer para prevenir. Gracias.
Okay, it's a very good question. Thank you. I would be asking again, do you have robust safeguarding training and human development training in regards to relationships, information? You know, our sisters in your formation houses, very kept up to date with developments in safeguarding, having a good understanding of healthy boundaries and living the code of conduct. Do you have screening for candidates before they are welcomed into your houses of formation? And that screening should be there, obviously, to identify risk. But if the screening identifies areas of growth, and I'm not here talking about risk, do you have sufficient resources in your formation house to enable those areas of growth to happen? Because this isn't about looking for the perfect postulant or aspirant to appear at your door, but do you have sufficient resources to help them? I also think it's important that formators have good formation training because, and some people have heard me say this before, it's not good if the formators are still under construction themselves. How can they, if they are still being formed themselves, be good formators? So there's lots there, I think, about screening and enabling really holistic human formation to happen for anyone, whether they're in a...
Gracias.
Yeah, wherever. Thank you, sister.
Todas.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I would like to thank our presenter, Ms. Tina Campbell, for sharing your expertise and your experiences with us on this important topic of care and safeguarding, particularly on how to respond to concerns and allegations. Tina, you are very, very, very calm, confident, and you explained in a very straight and direct language, simple language, some very profound aspects of care and safeguarding. It was a delight to listen to you. Thank you so much for the time and the knowledge that you shared with us. It's a very large group. We have benefited much from your presentation.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you for the invitation.
And I'd like to also thank our interpreters.
Thank you.
Had to cope from, with the different speeds, with different accent, especially Sylvia, Chiara, and Gabriele. Thank you so much. Grazie mille. And also thank you for the technicians, Sister Therese and Gianluca and others, for really helping us do this well for the breakout sessions. Not easy, but technology is a big help. But at the same time, there are hands and minds and heads that work behind that. Thank you so much for the care and attention with which you helped us conduct this webinar in a very nice way. Thank you so much. And I want to thank each one of you present here who are going out. I can see the numbers are moving out very fast. Thank you for your presence. It was really wonderful. It was an excellent experience that to have such a large group, profiting and benefiting from this very important topic. Thank you so much for coming. This is not the end. In March, on the 3rd of March, we have another webinar coming up. You will be informed soon. And there will be several others during the year, during which we will expose, explain more in detail, many aspects of care and safeguarding. So thank you so much. And just before I close, I invite Sister Therese. She wants to update you on the upcoming events, especially of February.